Knowing that both individuals and states tend to seek their own interest, a lesson made very clear by the failures of the Articles of Confederation that preceded the Constitution, the framers designed a set of institutions that would remedy the effects of our worst tendencies. Learning lessons from Greek and Roman history that would make Professor Kenny Morrell and Professor David Sick proud, the framers established a written constitution to prevent the concentration of power and the long train of abuses they experienced under George III. They established a federal system, for example, where powers are shared between national and state governments. They designed the national government to have a separation of powers and a system of checks and balances between three branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, to prevent any one branch from gaining too much power. And after anti-federalist resistance during ratification, they added a Bill of Rights to freedom of speech, the press, religion, and assembly, among others, to prevent a tyrannical leader or majority from overreaching. Their great hope was that carefully crafted institutions enshrined in a constitution upheld as the supreme law of the land would, as the preamble states, quote, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Yet as James Madison argued in Federalist 48, mere words on parchment, quote, are not sufficient guard against tyrannical concentrations of all the powers of government in the same hands. In other words, the Constitution is not self-enforcing, and even well-designed institutions are not self-governing. They are led by people, subject to all the whims and interests that are common to us all. As history has vividly shown, we cannot always count on leaders or citizens to preserve these institutions, respect the rule of law, recognize the separation of powers, or even uphold the Constitution itself, especially when transgressing established laws and norms might accrue them more power. In a system of checks and balances, we cannot count on, quote, ambition to counteract ambition, as Federalist 51 envisioned, if office holders are more committed to their party's ambition than the people's or that of their own branch. So a second way to keep our republic is through regular elections, which ensure that we, the people, have a voice and a vote. As Federalist 51 affirmed, quote, dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. Democratic elections enable us to express our interests, to hold leaders accountable, and choose representatives to reflect our values, preferences, and principles in the decisions they make in our name. The danger is that many of us tend to reduce politics to elections, which are episodic events every 2, 4, or 6 years, and insufficient to hold power accountable between these ballots. Moreover, given historic levels of polarization and the amount of money in politics, which I witnessed firsthand as chief of staff on campaigns for Congress here in Tennessee in 2010, elections can be easily captured by those with the most partisan ideology or the most economic power, especially now that corporations and wealthy elites can pour millions into campaigns, leaving democracy threatened by oligarchy. So even well-designed institutions and elections on their own are not enough to manage or tame self-interest or prevent the abuse of power. Therefore, tonight I want to offer a third vital constitutional safeguard: character. My central claim tonight is that preserving our Constitution requires good character, the set of intellectual, moral, and civic virtues that leaders and citizens need to secure and sustain our institutions, to elect wise leaders and hold them accountable, and to ensure liberty and justice, not just for some, but for all. If a democratic republic is to be self-governing, then we, the people, must be able to govern ourselves. The founders knew this. As numerous scholars have recognized, the founders, both Federalist and anti-Federalist, religious and secular, held that virtue is vital to self-government. Indeed, as the president of the National Constitution Center, Jeffrey Rhodes, has argued in his book, The Pursuit of Happiness, the founders followed ancient philosophers in holding that happiness was an aim not only of human life as individuals, but of states, of governments, and one that required an enduring commitment to good character. President George Washington identified the union between virtue and happiness in his first inaugural address. Without virtue, Thomas Jefferson affirmed, happiness cannot be. Many founders found the connection between virtue and happiness in religion, but not only religion and not only the Christian faith. As John Adams wrote in 1776, quote, all sober inquiries after truth, ancient and modern, pagan and Christian, have declared that the happiness of man, as well as his dignity, consists in virtue. Confucius, Zoroaster, Socrates, Muhammad have agreed in this. If there's a form of government, then, whose principle and foundation is virtue, will not every sober man acknowledge it better calculated to promote the general happiness than any other form? In addition to promoting happiness, the founders also believed that virtue is critical to preserving and securing liberty. Only virtuous people, Benjamin Franklin said, are capable of freedom. Or as John Adams affirmed, quote, liberty can no more exist without virtue and independence than the body can live and move without a soul. In other words, virtue animates our liberty and guides it toward morally good ends. For the founders, then, virtue is critical for two reasons in securing liberty. First, leaders and citizens need virtue to control selfish and unruly passions that may otherwise overwhelm their reason, inhibit their ability to make wise choices, and lead them to prefer their private good to the public good. Second, if virtue provides internal constraints on unbridled passions, it also supplies a safeguard against external threats of tyranny and domination. We need virtues of character, such as justice, wisdom, and courage, to remain vigilant, to identify potential tyrants, and to resist them. Quote, we may look up to our armies for our defense, wrote Samuel Adams, but virtue is our best security. Indeed, Adams writes elsewhere, quote, neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. He, therefore, is the truest friend of the liberty of his country, who tries most to promote its virtue, and who, so far as his power and influence extend, will not suffer a man be chosen into any office of power and trust who is not a wise and virtuous man. Virtue is so important to our founders that they elevated not only in essays, letters, and political documents, but also in histories and literature. In her early and influential history of the American Revolution, Mercy Otis Warren argued that the combined virtue of the rulers and the people needed to resist the outstretched arm of tyranny. Jeffrey Rosen, meanwhile, notes how several founders, including Franklin, Warren, and Hamilton, among others, wrote poems to capture the virtues in verse. Consider Philip Wheatley here, an enslaved woman who was emancipated after publishing her poems, is regarded as the first published African-American poet. She wrote a poem explicitly on virtue, describing it as a bright jewel she aims to comprehend and to cultivate. As Wheatley's poem demonstrates, virtue is not only a political project for the founders, but a deeply personal one too. This is evident, perhaps more than anywhere else, in the life of Benjamin Franklin. In 1726, around age 20, the age of students in this room, perhaps, Franklin conceived, quote, a bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection, which he details in his autobiography, a text I first read here at Rhodes in a Search for Values class. So owe Rhodes this insight. Franklin identified 13 virtues that he hoped to cultivate and devised a rigorous method to develop them. As you can see here, his list of virtues reflects his historical context in an early commercial republic and his personal preoccupations. It may not be the catalog of virtues we call upon today. It's hard to imagine, for example, that cleanliness, you can see the number 10, might be a virtue for many of us, though I think some students might prefer the roommates to have more of that. So it might be relevant for all of you. To develop these virtues, Franklin focused on one per week, and each day he reflects on how he committed any faults or not related to that virtue and kept track of his progress in a little notebook, which you can see represented here. As Franklin admits, and as history now clearly attests, he fell far short of moral perfection, but he nonetheless became a better and happier man, he says, than otherwise would have been. The 79-year-old Franklin attributed the constant felicity of his life to this important project, the virtues he strengthened through this effort. He was so convinced of his method that he planned to write an entire book on the advantages of each virtue and the mischiefs of its opposite vice, with the hope of convincing young people to embrace virtue, quote, to be happy. He planned to call the book The Art of Virtue, since it would not simply exhort readers to virtue, but also highlight the manner and means, the art of attaining it. For the founders, this art of virtue was especially important for political leaders. Madison makes this clear in Federalist 57. The aim of every political constitution is or ought to be, first, to obtain for rulers men who possess most wisdom to discern and most virtue to pursue the common good of society. In the next place, to take most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous. Such dependence on the people requires that citizens, and not just leaders, are also virtuous. This is clear in Madison's own speech at the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1787, when the Constitution itself hung in the balance. While Madison acknowledges that we cannot place unlimited confidence, he says, in our leaders, he defends, quote, this great Republican principle, that the people will have virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom. Is there no virtue among us, he asks? If there not be, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. This is why founders such as Noah Webster encourage citizens to vote on the basis of character. Quote, selecting men for office, let principle be your guide. Regard not the particular sect or denomination of the candidate. Look at his character. When a citizen gives his vote to a man of known immorality, he abuses his civic responsibility. He sacrifices not only his own interests, but that of his neighbor. He betrays the interest of his country. The founders, of course, knew that citizens will not always vote according to their character, and that, quote, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. They were realistic about human nature, which Alexander Hamilton acknowledged could be, quote, ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. He spares no words in that description. This is why founders designed institutions with a separation of powers and system of checks and balances to guard against these ills. Quote, dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, Madison wrote, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. Yet despite their emphasis on institutions and elections, contrary to what some historians now suggest, the founders never gave up on the importance of virtue. This is evident in Federalist 55, quote, as there is a degree of depravity in mankind, which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust. So there are other qualities in human nature, in other words, virtues, which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. That last claim is crucial here. A tyrant can, quote, regulate and manage the people through fear by the servile dread of his power, Samuel Williams wrote in 1775. But a free government, a Republican government, cannot be supported without virtue. The founders also knew, as Thomas Paine said in Common Sense, quote, that virtue is not hereditary, neither is it perpetual. Therefore, it must be educated. For the founders, education was a matter not only of developing knowledge and skill, but of forming character needed to keep our republic. According to Noah Webster, the influential educator who did create the first Webster's Dictionary, quote, education in a great measure forms the moral characters of men, and morals are the basis of government. Education should therefore be the first care of a legislature. Such morality requires not just understanding what is right or what democracy demands, but the motivation, desire, and settled disposition to do it. This is where much American politics, I think, falls short. Many citizens know what virtue requires, but they don't prioritize it above baser motives, especially when those motives might lead and serve their own advantage. This is also where much civic education falls short. We tend to assume that teaching citizens about democracy, about how to elect our officials, how to pass a bill, how to respect the rule of law, will be enough to keep our republic. But knowledge isn't inherently motivating. That's why formally and informally, we need to educate character to help us want to be virtuous, to order our knowledge and ability to morally good ends, and to motivate and maintain the vigilance needed to resist tyranny and domination. Webster knew this, quote, the virtues of citizens, he affirmed, are of more consequence to society than their abilities, and for this reason, the heart should be cultivated with more assiduity than the head. In other words, Webster anticipated what Rhodes President Bill Trout used to say when I was a student here at Rhodes about educating both the head and the heart. This is a very Rhodes kind of sentiment, I believe. And the founders sought to disseminate this education of the head and the heart through every part of the U.S., they said, even in the new territories that might become new states. The Northwoods Ordinance of 1787, issued the same year as the Constitutional Convention, required new states to encourage moral education for active citizenship. Quote, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. The founders especially valued higher education, especially in the liberal arts and sciences, which they believed are essential to teaching the knowledge and character needed to keep our republic. Given the levels of higher education at the time, the framers were, by comparison, very highly educated. In fact, one historian has described their sum of college experience as, quote, perhaps the most astonishing feature of the convention. At that convention, James Madison and Charles Pinckney proposed to give Congress the power to establish a university. The motion was narrowly defeated because delegates believed the new government already had the power to establish a university in the federal city. But Madison continued to advocate for a national university even beyond the convention. And so did George Washington. He wrote D.C.'s commissioners to encourage, quote, a liberal education in the arts and sciences to prepare students for, quote, public as well as private life. Washington focuses not only on forming character through the curriculum, but also through friendships across differences. Seeing their value among soldiers in the Revolutionary War, the former general believed that the same kind of mixing of people, he said, from different parts of the country made a national university that would do the same of the highest importance. Washington made a similar argument to Congress and even left 50 shares of Potomac River Company's stock to endow a national university, a very personal commitment. At a time when universities are being targeted now by the federal government, Washington's political and personal support of higher education is all the more striking. Though the U.S. government never established a national university, many states established universities, including my home state now of North Carolina. Our Constitution of 1776 states that, quote, that all useful learning shall be duly encouraged and promoted in one or more universities. Some founders of our country were also founders of these universities. Perhaps most famous is Thomas Jefferson. So proud of he was founding UVA that it was one of the only 3 titles engraved on his tombstone. Not governor of Virginia or even president of the United States, but father of the University of Virginia. For our purposes, it's revealing that Jefferson and his fellow UVA commissioners believed the university's purpose was not simply to promote knowledge, but also to shape character needed for democratic leadership and citizenship. As he wrote in the Rockfish Gap report, the aims of so-called higher branches of education, he said, were among others, quote, to form the statesmen, legislators, and judges on whom public prosperity and individual happiness are so much to depend, to develop the reasoning faculties of our youth, enlarge their minds, cultivate their morals, and instill into them the precepts of virtue and order, and generally to form them to habits of reflection and correct action, rendering them examples of virtue to others and of happiness within themselves. For his part, Benjamin Franklin founded the academy that became later the University of Pennsylvania. Its Latin motto, you can see it here around the seal, is fittingly translated as laws without morals are useless. In one essay on education, Franklin describes what higher education should include: the study of literature, history, math, astronomy, geography, languages, religion, and strikingly, morality. As these examples suggest, early American colleges made moral education an intentional and explicit aim. But that aim has faded from view in the last century, due in part to the increasing pluralism of American life, the rise of the research university, and shifting economic pressures. As a result, many colleges and universities have abandoned an intentional commitment to educating character, but not Wake Forest and not Rhodes College. At Wake Forest, we started a program for leadership and character that engages faculty, students, and staff across the entire university. And with support from Lilly Endowment, Inc., we have launched the Educating Character Initiative, which has catalyzed a national movement of colleges and universities focused on educating character. And this appetite for this work has been really extraordinary. I've been really encouraged by the number of institutions who've now applied for grants from our initiative. We've now given out over 150 grants, totaling $35 million to institutions across the country, including public and private universities, liberal arts colleges, community colleges, military academies, women's colleges, HBCUs, and many others. And it'll be no surprise to you in this room that Rhodes College is one of our first recipients. Over the last year, faculty and staff here at Rhodes have been exploring creative ways to cultivate character in the classroom and across campus. And I'll just say that our entire team has been impressed by the thoughtfulness, commitment, and care that faculty and staff here at Rhodes have shown. So kudos to all of you. Of course, as we all know here, that these efforts are not new at Rhodes. Commitments to character reflected in our honor code and on the values of truth, loyalty, and service imprinted in our seal have long been hallmarks of a Rhodes education. Writing 100 years ago in 1925, just as he moved the college from Clarksville here to Memphis, President Charles Deal elevated character as a core aim of the college. Quote, the institution we had in mind was one which was vitally concerned with scholarship, but was even more concerned with character. An institution that stands for the essential permanence of truth, beauty, and goodness. This commitment not only reflects Rhodes' past and present, but also its future. As President Collins affirmed in a recent Rhodes Magazine article on the next 100 years of Rhodes College, Rhodes seeks to, quote, provide a transformative education that helps shape and develop leaders of character and integrity in whatever field they choose to pursue. The founders of our college and our country would be proud. Of course, in looking to our founders, we must also be keenly aware of how far they fell short, even of their own professed ideals. The Constitution denied political equality to women and enslaved people. The founders' views of politics and education privileged white and wealthy men. And their accounts of virtue were, in some cases, tainted by assumptions around race, class, and gender that we would and should rightly and vigorously reject today. We don't need history's hindsight to expose this hypocrisy, especially when those who were enslavers. As historians such as Manisha Sinha have argued, there were early abolitionists who challenged their slaveholding colleagues, and many enslaved people, such as Elizabeth Freeman, pictured here, who were agents of their own liberation, protesting, petitioning, and in some cases successfully suing for their freedom based on principles embedded in our Constitution. Meanwhile, many women pressed for moral and political equality against the patriarchy of the time. Perhaps most famous is Abigail Adams. In a letter to her husband John in 1776, while he was away declaring independence and forming a new government, Abigail pleaded for him to, quote, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we determine to foment a rebellion. And we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Now, Adams and his framers did not remember the ladies very well that summer, and when they established a new government. In fact, the Ninth Amendment, giving women the right to vote, was not ratified until 1920. That fact really still shocks me. So as these other examples show, we must not lionize or sanitize our founders. We should question their commitments to virtue as we question and evaluate our own. Luckily, the founders licensed such critical questioning and engagement. As Madison writes in Federalist 14, quote, is it not the glory of the people of America that whilst they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times and other nations, they have not suffered a blind veneration for antiquity, for custom, or for names, to overrule the suggestions of their own good sense, the knowledge of their own situation, and the lessons of their own experience. That if we look across the history of our republic, we see many second and third century founders, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and civil rights activists such as Anna Julia Cooper and Martin Luther King Jr., adapting and expanding the language of virtue and character to reform our republic and help hold it true to its early promises. According to Ida B. Wells Barnett, whose legacy we still feel here in Memphis, virtue knows no color line, and I'd add no gender or class line either. So to conclude now, as I began, with a story about Benjamin Franklin. In 1731, when he was 25 years old, just a few years older than the students here tonight, he wrote some observations on reading history in the library, just as some of you might write after a coffee-fueled night of studying in the Barrett Library, with a view that, quote, the great affairs of the world, the wars, revolutions, etc., are carried on and affected by parties. Franklin proposed creating a united party for virtue by forming the virtuous and good men of all nations into a regular body to be governed by suitable good and wise rules. Elsewhere, he drafted a creed to bind this august party. It included the beliefs that, quote, virtuous men ought to league together to strengthen the interest of virtue in the world, and so strengthen virtue themselves in virtue, that knowledge and learning is to be cultivated and ignorance dissipated, that none but the virtuous are wise, that man's perfection is in virtue. Given our divisions today in the U.S., much less across the globe, we should not expect to form a united party of virtue, much less one that includes only men. But our nation would be better if we could, across parties, at least form a united front, one that recognizes that we need leaders and citizens of character to preserve and defend our Constitution, that education, including higher education, can play a vital role in cultivating knowledge and character. If the Constitution calls us to form a more perfect union, a vital step is first to form more perfect citizens. In this sense, my appeal tonight is not only historical or philosophical, but deeply personal and practical. Students, hope you will see the purpose of college here at Rhodes especially is not only to gain knowledge or get a job, though those are very important, but to also cultivate your character in the classroom and in the community so you can become leaders and citizens who can keep our republic. Fellow faculty and staff, hope we can see how we're already are forming character, even if unconsciously, and resolve to do so more critically and intentionally to prepare our students to lead and serve our communities in Memphis and far beyond. And for all of us here as citizens, hope we can unite to elevate virtue and defend the Constitution and higher education at a time when both are imperiled. On July 3rd, 1776, the eve of our Declaration of Independence, when John Adams was uncertain about the future of the American experiment, he confessed that even a state of dreadful calamities can sometimes still have a good effect. Quote, "It will inspire us with many virtues which we have not, and correct many errors, follies, and vices which threaten to disturb, destroy, and dishonor us. The furnace of affliction produces refinement in states as well as individuals." Many of us may feel that we're in a furnace of affliction right now. But I have a humble and steadfast hope born of my education here at Rhodes College, that this crucible can produce a refinement of character. What have we got? A republic or a monarchy? Franklin's answer reminds us that the success of the American experiment is in our hands. As we the people envision the future of our republic, may we have the character to keep it. Thank you.
Professor Shin will have the microphone and he will find you if you have questions, so please raise your hand. And we'd like to start with students, so if any of you have questions, please raise your hand and Professor Shin will find you.
Any questions? There's one in the back here. Perfect.
Hello. Oh, thank you for that. So I'm kind of curious, like, do you believe that a holistically virtuous society is obtainable, considering how you prioritize education in that facet and how could be argued that what virtue is and how it is obtained would be a divided answer as of now?
Yeah, I hear two questions in that. One is it possible to be fully virtuous? And secondly, how do we determine what virtue is when we're so divided about those questions, right? So I'll try to take one at a time. I think the first one is I think we can't have a fully virtuous society. I think that's impossible. But we can become more virtuous, and we become more virtuous than we are now. I do think that human nature is quite complex. I think Hamilton got it right. We can be quite self-interested, focus on our own sort of power, our own advantage, but also have seen qualities of and moments in time where people do rise above their own private good to serve the public good. I think we can do more of that, and we should do more of that to really ensure that Constitution, which does govern all of us, not just some of us, can actually apply across the country. So I think we can be more virtuous. Much of my own work is premised on that very assumption that this work in higher education and beyond can help us be better people. And I've seen students actually grow in very important ways across 4 years. In fact, we're doing studies now at Wake Forest and beyond of measuring pre and post effects of character interventions, be it courses or programs, and we actually see real significant growth in students in these courses and programs. I think it is possible, and I think evidence shows that it is possible. Not perfect, but possible. The second question is a much harder one, I think, in part because we are so divided right now. And what justice means to one person might mean something different to someone else. What courage might mean might look different to someone else. I think that's one advantage of virtue ethics. It actually is not just a rule that everybody abides by, universal rule. It requires context and wisdom to discern different ways in which it might show up in different contexts, right? So I think it's one advantage, and that creates a real challenge for us to build consensus around virtue. So what I think is the challenge, though, is that we easily kind of wave our hands at these divisions and thinking they're not possible. But I think actually if you ask people about certain virtues like honesty or courage or compassion, most would actually affirm their importance. I think the issue is not about affirming their importance, it's about actually how they prioritize their importance among other motives, right? And I think too often we all agree on what's virtuous, but we don't actually prioritize that when other kind of motives might arise. So I think it's more about a crisis of priorities than one about our general acceptance of virtue as a category. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that analysis. Thank you. I'll just say while we're getting the mic passed here, St. Augustine, who I spent a lot of time studying, has this great idea of the order of one's loves. And it's not that people should love things. How they order their loves is quite important. So I think often we love virtue, not as much as we love power or money or other things, right? So if virtue becomes a means to power or money, then that's a real disorder of our loves. And I think in this case, our loves are quite disordered as a country right now. We often prioritize other things besides virtue, even though we love it a little bit, right? Yeah, great.
Hi. So my question is, I know you talk a lot about education in regards to enhancing virtue, right? And as a means to kind of bring us all together. So other than education, what would you say some other means are for uniting us and elevating that virtue?
That's a great question. I think education, I mean, in this case, quite formally, higher education, universities, colleges like Rhodes. I think there are various forms of education, though, or formation that can happen beyond just a formal schooling environment. I think how we think about certain community organizations that we're a part of can help us think about these questions. I think how we do work in common projects. So now Rhodes is very committed, for example, to community engagement here. I was a service scholar at Rhodes. I did a lot of work each week in different parts of the city, and that formed my character dramatically. Being in relationship with other people outside my own sort of expertise, outside my own area, and really expanding my views about what empathy required, what justice required, what courage looked like in different contexts. And so I think that's one way. I think we need to think about education very broadly in this account. So I do think common projects can really be useful for that. Now, one challenge is our country is now reducing its common projects and associations. The famous example of Robert Putnam bowling alone. We don't bowl together anymore. We bowl alone, right? And I think now we bowl on our screens, right? It's very, very isolated, and it's very sort of focused on our own sort of immediate area. So I do worry that we're losing possibilities for contact that actually might bring us into other kinds of relationships like Washington actually talked about, right? Where in his case, it was the war that brought people together across these differences to find a common purpose. What is it for us now? And I think hope it's not a war. We don't need a war, but can we find other ways to replicate that kind of common commitment, common purpose? I think that would be very helpful for us in forming character and really sort of building those bonds that get beyond just individualized and localized sort of biases or commitments in that way. So great question, thank you. See one here.
So I guess one of my concerns or questions with how you're explaining the dissemination of like virtuous ideals is how that involves people across socioeconomic statuses. Because if we limit this conversation, we're not saying that you are, but if it does get primarily grouped into higher education, that feels incredibly limiting. And I don't think that unity can solely exist amongst people who already have access to the same things.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, actually. And so I focus on higher ed in part because we're at a college tonight. I work at a college. That's my own sort of work tonight. And I do think that given higher ed's sort of situation now in our culture, it's being questioned. Its values being questioned. It's being at times sort of targeted by certain government agencies about its sort of its value. And so I think in that sense it is relevant. I totally agree with you, though, that we can't just rely on colleges and universities, in part because not everybody goes to colleges and universities. And we need to expand our view of what education might mean beyond just formal methods. Now, I do think K-12 schools play a very important role in this, and those are public institutions that do affect most individuals as they come up through the process. I also think we need other ways of doing this. It often happened in the past in these institutions that involve kind of core commitments and values and practices. So often communities of faith, right, of various kinds, actually help form character. As Americans have now moved away from some of those communities of faith, that's not forming character in the same ways as it used to. We used to rely on civic organizations, right, and communities to do that. Those are now dissipating, right, in our communities. So I think these institutions that once formed us and were anchors for our communities are now sort of being sort of diminished in some way. So I do think it means we have to do more in education itself, K through 12 and perhaps higher education, to make sure we don't lose that social fabric and the kind of formative effect it might have on citizens. So thank you for that question. And I would just say one thing I've really committed to at Wake Forest is expanding those who actually have access to this kind of education. So we're doing a lot of work in our Educating Character Initiative, not just for places like Rhodes or Wake Forest, but for community colleges and for others who actually really expand the access to this kind of work, because I think those are really important places for this work to happen, and we need that work to happen there to really unite our country across our differences. So thank you. Questions over here from Professor Nelson has one. I'm worried about that one. Let me drink a big glass of water to buy some time here, Mike.
Hello. Sorry. You talked about kind of morality being like the biggest thing that keeps our democracy a republic and not a monarchy, but I was curious, like, your thoughts on how we know, like, if when we have lost the republic, if there is a monarchy.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is where we need, so I do think that certain key constraints that our Constitution enshrines that are quite important for us. So one is separation of powers, right, where powers between different branches are actually distinctive. If you have someone who's trying to sort of obliterate separation of powers and not recognize limits on their own office, right, that could be a case for that being an issue. If, for example, checks and balances that were once actually set in stone to help check powers of one office or the other are not functioning because those are being ignored, or they're doing different things outside of standard norms and laws to sort of create new orders or to advance certain agendas, that could be a case where power is being sort of shifting beyond our constitutional limitations. And so I think it's being aware of that, that shift for us to understand that. I do think that we do have safeguards. We do have the courts, for example. We have different kinds of laws, but we also need to make sure that people actually respect the laws and uphold the laws and see the law as a constraint on action. And so I think we do need courts to maintain that. So I'm not worried that we are there yet. I do think, though, that we can't, in other words, these laws and courts aren't just abstract things that operate on their own. They're also governed by people with certain interests and ideals, and so making sure they have character, but also that we as citizens hold them accountable to these things and also act ourselves to know when these things are emerging. So I do think for the founders, at least, wisdom was very important to know when there just may be a very aggressive democratic leader, one that might become a tyrant in some way. So that's a very hard line to walk, and we need wisdom, we need experience. And I think it's where history can be a great guide to us, looking back in the past when people did make encroachments on our constitutional limitations and finding ways in which that did become perhaps a tyranny and when it might have been checked. I think history can be a great guide to us if we actually attend to history in the ways that we need to. So thank you.
Michael, at least half a dozen of the quotes from the founders that you showed us included the word happiness. And obviously it meant more to them than just being in a good mood. But what did it mean to them? What did they have in mind when they talked about happiness?
That's a great question. So my understanding, Mike, and it's really informed by my reading of the founders, but also of ancient philosophy, which they were drawing on very explicitly. So the founders were often reading ancient philosophy texts, especially Cicero, whose Tusculan Disputations really elevates happiness and virtue as being a core commitment. The Stoics, they're reading a lot of the Stoics, and some Greek philosophy, especially sort of Plato and Socrates and Xenophon especially. And so often these ancient philosophers, both Greek and Roman, saw happiness not as a good mood, not as feeling good. It's not Pharrell Williams happy, it's a different kind of happy, right? It might include feeling good, but it's really more about flourishing, about well-being. So it's not a subjective state, it's more of an objective state that we're flourishing. And for the ancients, they thought flourishing was not just about feeling certain things, but actually having our thoughts, feelings, and actions ordered in ways toward goods, toward goods that actually exist in the world and we want to pursue in some way. So the virtues became those excellences, those qualities that help us pursue the goods in ways that lead us to flourish. And that was their view of happiness, I believe, at the end. There's been debates about what happiness means in the Declaration, for example. Is it about property from Locke or about these older ideals? I do think that if you look at other texts beyond this Declaration itself, that they had a much wider view of happiness as a kind of flourishing that went beyond just mere pleasure or mood. So thanks for the question.
So now with social media, we're like kind of like the closest and also like the farthest away from each other in like human history. And with like you have a combination of echo chambers and having people hearing their own opinions over and over again, do you believe to a certain extent that leads to a lack of empathy for others because they only hear like what other people believe similar to them instead of hearing different opinions?
Yeah, great question. We actually talked about this actually earlier today in a conversation. So I think yes and no. On one hand, we're more connected than we ever have been and can therefore understand what's happening around the world that might give us a chance to be empathetic, right? We know now what's happening across different continents. We can be alert to the news and see what's really occurring. So that might give us a chance to be more empathetic if we are connected across these differences. But the challenge is we often are less focused on other people's suffering and more about our own enjoyment, our own knowledge, our own sort of engagement in some ways. And I do think the way that technology is often structured and designed is meant to be addictive intentionally. So we are glued to our phones. The fact that they're bright colors and having the little dings when they come on a new message, right? They addict us to these devices that make us more drawn into this work. And as Sherry Turkle talks about in her book, we are alone together. We're together, but we're all alone on our own devices, right, in our own worlds. And so I do think it really limits empathy. I also think empathy is really built, what research shows, and Professor Haberman and I talked about this today in our discussion with students, that often we build empathy through personal contact, including eye-to-eye contact, right? If you're on a screen, you're not actually seeing someone's eyes. You're seeing maybe a picture of their eyes, but not their eyes. Even on Zoom, right? On Zoom, you're looking at the screen, and the camera's up here. So you're looking at the screen, and your eyes are down here to see their eyes, but they're seeing you looking down at the screen, right? There's not eye-to-eye contact there. And so it's hard to actually connect in some way, the real way, with someone in that way. And our minds are wired to have mirror neurons, to actually be able to engage in it and mirror back other people's behaviors and thoughts and feelings, to be sort of empathetic in that way. So I do worry that these mediators, screens, technologies actually prevent us from having that face-to-face contact that might make us more empathetic. So I do think if you can find ways to put down the phone, to be present fully in your interactions at meals, in the rat, right, on walks across campus, right? Put your phone away, put it in your bag, and let that presence be a way to sort of help you cultivate empathy in that way. I think that would be really helpful to find intentional ways to resist these temptations. Now, I don't think technology is bad, right? I think it's quite good for us. I actually have an article on digital temperance as a virtue. It's not just abstinence. We actually need temperance, right? We actually are temperate in our use of technology to make sure we're doing it that does help us court with our own flourishing or happiness, not just for what actually we feel titillated by, right, in these moments of real engagement with our phones. So it's a great question, and I really think this generation needs to be more, I think, intentional about creating boundaries on our use of technology. All of us do, right? I'm guilty of it as well. So thank you.
First off, thank you for speaking tonight. And my question is, how do you think religion impacts virtue?
That's a great question. We could be here all night. So if you need to go now, feel free to head out. So I do study different traditions, and I've done a lot of work on St. Augustine, for example, as one example of that. I do think religion and other kinds of traditions, be them religious or moral, often include ideals, beliefs, practices, rituals that shape who we are. Right? They form us in certain ways. If we do things over and over again, we become habituated in a certain way of being or thinking or feeling, right? And so religions do that, schools do that, right? Families do that, right? Certain rituals in your family can form you in various ways. And so I do think these traditions are very powerful. And if you look across traditions, right, across Western traditions like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, you also look at Confucianism and Taoism in the East, right? They all elevate what might be a concept of virtue. They might not call it virtue. They might call it ways of being, right? Or certain qualities that you have, but they all sort of recognize that human beings are always in formation, and we need things around us to help support us in that. In fact, I had a quote in the longer version of this talk about religion. Benjamin Franklin, in one letter to a critic of religion, says, listen, I understand you have concerns. You might be able to be virtuous without religion, but many people rely on religion to habituate these qualities, right? To make us practice them over and over again in community with others, so we can become a certain way of being. So I do think it can be a helpful support to character, but not required in that way. But it's a great question, and it's one I think about a lot in my own work. So thank you. Other questions? See one here too.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about the end behavior of essentially the Republic. Do you think that, I mean, well, we've been vacillating sort of between extremes for a really long time, right? I mean, an example would be like the first Gilded Age. Some would say we're entering a second. But of course, after the Gilded Age, we had the Great Depression and a long period of relative like fiscal equality. And I wonder, again, going back to the end behavior of the Republic, are we going to continue to vacillate forever? Is this healthy? Will we converge to a certain point where of like virtue, where we start to figure things out? Or unfortunately, do you think the reality is we're just going to diverge because of self-interest?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think political scientists have wrestled with this question for a long time. There's a book by David Runciman from Cambridge, a political scientist, historian of politics there, called The Confidence Trap. It talks about different ways of democracy going through these different cycles where there's kind of failure and then we kind of muddle through and become sort of okay again, then we kind of have failure again and muddle through again, right? Kind of is going through these cycles. And I think Russman gives kind of historical perspective on that that's helpful for us. It might give us more hope that this may be a cycle, a down point in our cycle, we might come through it. But I also think what Runciman ignores in that analysis is he has, I think, so much faith in institutions to carry us through that if there are actually real threats to institutions, then that's going to be a real problem. So I do worry that his analysis actually ignores the potential threats to institutions, and he also ignores ways to reform institutions. So for example, he gives a few examples of democratic movements that were failures, right? But they're actually, the examples he gives actually weren't very effective movements. There are many other movements he doesn't actually talk about that could have been examples in that book that might have given more hope about democracy actually being able to be reformed in some ways. So our history is very important for us. We must recognize it's also embedded with certain assumptions about what history is, what good examples are, and I think being critical about that's very important for us. So I do think right now we're in a cycle, and there could be a cycle that comes out of this, but I think it's up to us, frankly, how we respond. I think it's easy for us to say, well, history will take us through, or institutions will take us through, or leaders take us through, but actually it's up to us. And my hope in this talk is not to say that this is all bad, but it's up to us. And I think it's up to you all to do this work. And so I want to make sure we don't ignore our responsibility and opportunity to be part of this effort to keep our republic. But thanks for your question.
I just wanted to ask, so a lot of what you were talking about was about college and, education in general. But do you think that it's possible to teach or promote virtue to people that are already in power and like people that have, passed their sort of formative educational phase?
So you're saying I should go to D.C. right now? I should go to D.C.? I might need to do that. I do think, there's two answers to this question. One is it possible? And I think the research says it is possible. In fact, human beings, research shows, are changing their character all through their later years. In fact, into their 70s at least in some studies, right? Jason can tell more about that, give them that research on that. But I do think it is possible. In fact, we are changing all the time, and we can be changed. So is it possible? Yes. Does being in power make you inclined to change when who you are got you power? Probably not, right? So we have to be aware of the ways in which these outside constraints, including power and privilege and popularity, might actually form how we think of ourselves and our need to change, right? So I think it is possible. I do think, though, given the current realities we face in politics, that for me, I think the investment in our young people is my personal commitment to doing that work now. I think it can be hard to change when you're older and when so much is at stake. When your whole political party or your whole career is at stake, it's much harder to change. But if you're in college, when so much is open, you can make those choices now, that's when it's real possible. And you can set a whole life course that's really crucial. One scholar talks about the decade of the 20s as being this very important decade. And if you make a decision, for example, to fly west to the West Coast, and you just move it, you might be going to LA, but just move it slightly, you wind up in Seattle, right? That's a big difference. But a small change early on can actually end up in very different directions, right? So changing now, and make sure you're going the right way now, can set you up for a really important journey beyond. So I do think now is the right time. But I don't have despair about it, but I'm not investing my time there right now. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hi. My question is kind of, you talked about during your presentation about like holding leaders accountable and how we can't rely on leaders to move us forward and that it's the responsibility of the citizens. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but I know that a lot of people are feeling like our leadership is very inaccessible in this time period. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on are like how, and you also talked about how like accountability happens between elections as well. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on how we can continue to hold leaders accountable when they do feel so far away and inaccessible?
That's a great question, and I think it's really challenging right now. One is that, I think there are various ways to do that, and I think one of the most prominent ways now is through kinds of protests. You see them across the country in different contexts, right? People kind of gather together to protest a certain way of being. That's a very important way to do it. I do worry that our imagination for resistance and for accountability is only protest. I think it's really one effective mode, but there are other modes too, right? There's ways of building sort of coalitions to help sort of focus on certain issues or broad-based coalitions that focus on many issues that hold leaders accountable. So in my work in graduate school, I did a lot of work on community organizing and seeing community organizers in different communities come together, build relationships across differences, across institutions, leverage institutional power to bring institutions to bear in certain issues, and then invite candidates for different elections to their institutions to talk about their stances, and then make decisions based on that kind of engagement. But it's very local, very personal, where they kind of force, because of how the power they'd accrued, the relationships and institutions, they force candidates to come and speak to them in some way. And so I do think there are models of community engagement. There's one book called Blessed Are the Organized by Jeffrey Stout, from Princeton. That's a really great kind of case study of how one organization uses these sort of practices to really hold people accountable. So I think we need more of that kind of work. There are other ways you can do it, by writing representatives, by using your influence in some ways, by joining together as groups. So I do want to encourage a wider imagination about what political action might be right now, including actually helping your colleagues and friends think about what it means to be citizens in this moment, and to talk about that and to engage that, to have classes on that in college. I do think there's a lot of ways we can be thoughtful about accountability that aren't just about voting or these more public protests. I think, again, I think they're really important, and history shows they're very important, right, for catalyzing and sort of cohering a movement. But before those big protests, for example, imagine the civil rights movement, for example, which I've studied the most. It would be months of work by local leaders, often women, invisible women, behind the scenes, often in churches, organizing folks to come to a march. They would not have a march until they actually had enough people to be there for the march, right? So there's a big march, but actually it would take months to organize a march often. And we often ignore that hard labor, that relational work that's often invisible, it's not very public, but it's often what makes the big public things happen. We have to invest in those kind of relationships and the real work of building communities that actually can be in conversation with each other across differences to then leverage that power for accountability. Thanks. Other questions? One in the back, I see. Great. There might be a silent protest here, people leaving my talk now. I get it. Okay, I get it.
I think that a lot of us would like to think that power and resources in our society are distributed in some way by virtue. do you think that this should be the case, or do you think that this is the case?
That was Aristotle's view in ancient Greece, that you were distribute goods according to virtue. I'm of the opinion that it depends on the goods and it depends on what's being distributed. So, for example, you might think that I wish we distributed praise based on virtue, not based on wealth or based on status or based on other things that might even be more sinister, right? So I do wish we had sort of respect and praise distributed that way, but I think healthcare based on need, right? I think certain things like rights and responsibilities based on fundamental equality, right? So I do think that different kinds of things that are distributed need different criteria of distribution. And so I'm very hesitant about, because I think one challenge of virtue, I think one limit of virtue is that in the past, sometimes people got certain basic goods based on virtue or limited views of what virtue was, and others who were denied those goods, right? So virtue can be weaponized in certain ways too to advance a certain agenda, right? So be very careful about how it can be used, for example. So if you think about this, one example of this is often it's used to think about people who are in poverty. Well, they don't have enough character. If they just worked harder and were more gritty, they could do the work without recognizing how structures and systems actually, or history, might actually shape their outcomes and conditions for their work. And if we then appeal to character in that distribution method, we might be missing out on what's really happening behind the scenes, right? So I do worry about character being all-encompassing as a distribution model, but I do think for some things it could be useful to recognize it on certain virtues. I wish we had more people who did distribute praise and esteem based on virtue, not based on fame or celebrity or money or power in some way. So does that get at your question? Yeah, great, thank you. Great question, students. It's a really wonderful question. I'm very impressed. Good to see you, David.
Hi. I was really intrigued by the idea that we might agree on what virtues are, but disagree on prioritization, and it got me thinking about things that we might prioritize above virtue, and several of them are things that I would say are not virtuous, like money or power, selfish kinds of things. But then I got kind of hung up on people might prioritize safety over virtue. Mm-hmm. And I was curious how you might respond to someone that would say, well, virtue's nice if you're safe, but I've got to prioritize safety over virtue.
Yeah, great question. And I want to think about that a little bit. I mean, one initial thought would be that I'd ask the question, safety from whom or from what, right? I think often, the reason I say that is that often parties, leaders use fear, including fear that might disrupt safety, as a rhetorical tool to generate power. In fact, that's what Samuel Williams said in 1775, that tyrants use fear, Republican governments need virtue. Now, so I think if it's safety, there's a matter of what safety from what or for what. I also don't think that they are actually necessarily competing always. So, for example, we need to keep people safe. If you had leaders who were courageous and wise and resilient with certain skills they might need to keep people safe, that actually could be quite helpful for safety, right? So I think it's a question about safety from what or for what, and how is fear of unsafety being used in this case to create emergencies that then justify kinds of extra judicial powers, right? Look at history, right? I took humorous classes, I understand this, right? The history actually is examples of people using situations of emergency often to extend the remit of law or norm in ways that might not have been justified, but might serve their interests in certain ways. So I do think, I'm not saying it always should prioritize in certain matters of war, for example. We might need to think about what virtue means, but even there's a whole theory of just war. Going to war for just causes and also being just in war that actually put constraints on what might be possible. So I do think we can't, I do worry about the erosion of norms in our current culture and the role that norms play in constraining our behaviors. And I think we have to make sure we don't lose all norms in that. But I want to think more about that because I think it's a really important question. I think safety is a good example because it is something that we all need and want as a precondition for flourishing, right? So when things that actually might contribute to flourishing, like safety, might be in conflict with virtue, that's a real hard one. And I want to think more about that. Those are some initial reflections, so thank you. We have maybe time for one more question? Yeah, great. All right. Final question. Bring us home here. Bring us home. All right.
I don't want to usurp an opportunity for students, though. So if there's a student question.
Go for it, Jason.
Okay,
You did, bring us home. Here we go.
All right. Thanks for the great talk. Really appreciate it. So I was recently introduced to Roxanne Gay's idea of the myth of civil discourse, and this constant call to respond to sort of uncivil acts with respect and civility from our leadership. So I was just wondering, she has all sorts of recommendations about like how you can engage in uncivil discourse that might be more effective at eliciting change. Speaking of how to move forward. Of course, she's not calling for violence of any form. But how does uncivil discourse sort of fit within your framework of virtue?
Yeah, great question. I think, and also a very complicated question. The way I understand virtue is that virtue is context sensitive. So to be just requires not only knowing what justice requires, but doing it in that particular context, in that way for those people in a very, particular context. Same thing for wisdom. We need wisdom to figure out what's going to be most helpful in different contexts. It's not just one thing applies across all contexts. It's very discerning about what's needed here and there and how and what amount, right? And so I do think that in this case, I do think that I do think generally civic discourse can be very helpful for us at having conversations. But if conversations keep breaking down, and those who are in power might be using civility to hide their own agendas or to sort of rule out certain critiques or protests from them, which I think Gay talks about, right? Then there may be other ways you might think about certain forms of resistance or expression. And I do think, for example, that anger is not always a bad political emotion, right? Anger can actually be ways to register an injustice. We ought to be angry about some things, right? We shouldn't just be stoic about everything. We should be angry about some things because anger actually helps us unite and to recognize when injustice actually happens. So one thing that many organizers often ask when they go to communities is, what makes you angry? Because what we see when we look at movements across time, and Anthony Appiah wrote a book called The Honor Code about how movements across time, be it abolition of slavery or even changes around foot binding in the East, for example, how they changed over time. And what he argues there is that we often don't change because we have a shared vision of what we hope for. It's what we're against that actually helps motivate change. Against certain kind of brutality of slavery, for example. That motivated us, made us angry. It ignited our own disgust. It actually helped kind of catalyze this movement, right, that rejected this inhumane treatment. So I think sometimes it takes asking questions about what makes us angry to understand what we actually are against. And that can be helpful for mobilizing movement. But I worry, though, that the danger of anger is that it becomes its own habit. Anger is useful if it's an emotion. If it becomes its own habit or disposition, it can become a vice, right? Not a virtue. So I think anger can be used helpfully, contextually, but if it becomes a habit that we always go to, that becomes really dangerous and I think really kind of deforming of our own civil behavior and activity. So I do want to put a limit on anger too. Also, the difference between anger and rage, right? There's different categories. There can be kinds of cool anger that often are used to actually help bring about change. That might not be rage, right? So I don't want to kind of be thoughtful about the different kinds of anger and incivility here and what would mean in certain contexts. And also, how has in the past certain attempts at civility actually, have they failed? What caused them to fail, right? How can we think about that contextual history as a way to understand what's appropriate in this context in particular? So it would be more a contextual answer using wisdom, but also allowing different modes of civic engagement in that process. So, great. I don't hear much anger yet, so thank you all for a great set of questions. I really appreciate it very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.